Hey, welcome back to Law and Crime. I'm your host for the remainder of the afternoon, Vincent Hill. We have a lot to cover today. We want to talk about the George Burch trial and this conviction. We also want to tell you about a child molester who was sentenced to 300 years, but unfortunately won't spend a day in prison. But first, we want to talk about Tex McIver. He's the high-powered attorney in Atlanta who's accused of killing his wife. He actually admitted to killing his wife. He's set to go on trial. Jury selection is this Monday in Atlanta. But before we go into that, we want to bring in Law and Crime's very own Rachel Stockman to give us the latest on the Tex McIver case.
The murder trial of a prominent Atlanta attorney is expected to start in just days. Claude Tex McIver, 74 years old, is charged with the 2016 shooting death of his wife, Diane. McIver was sitting behind Diane in the passenger seat of a car, and a friend was driving when he apparently opened fire, shooting Diane through her back. McIver claims the shooting was a mistake. This is what McIver's attorney told the judge at a bond hearing last year.
Mr. McIver had a pistol in his lap, and the pistol went off, or was accidentally fired. There was no argument, there was no quarrel. He was, according to Mr. Carter, he was asleep at the time. She stopped at the traffic light, and the first thing she heard was an explosion.
But prosecutors believe he had a financial motive to kill his wife. McIver is charged with malice murder, felony murder, and 5 other counts. We'll be streaming that trial starting Monday right here on the Law and Crime Network. I'm Rachel Stockman.
All right, joining me on Law and Crime is Andell Brown, defense attorney out of Florida. Andell, thanks for coming on this afternoon.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Well, first, let me ask you, what do you make of this case? I mean, it has all of the things that people look for. You have these 2 rich people. You have money. You have, oh, it was an accident. What do you make of this case, and how do you actually prosecute this case?
Well, if I was a prosecutor, I would start looking for what are the motives Tex McIver would have had for taking his wife's life on that night. What are the reasons why he would have done such a thing? And I think one of the things you touched on, Vince, was money. There were financial issues that he was having in his business. There were wills, second wills, all types of big and sexy facts floating around. There were, secrets. There were loans. All types of things were going on that Tex McIver gave him a reason to take his wife's life. There were the manipulations, allegedly. There were the statements that he tried to keep from coming in, the people he tried to keep from talking, the witnesses that, according to the prosecution, he tried to tamper with. All of these things are what the prosecution would use to prove that this wasn't an accident, as the defense is saying, but a cold, calculated plot.
Well, you said it right. It does have everything to make this a sexy case. But let me play devil's advocate. I spend a lot of time in Atlanta. I know exactly where this shooting happened. I own a pistol. I'm a carry concealed holder. There's certain spots in Atlanta where I sometimes carry my gun, not in my holster, but in the reach of my car. So when you take that to a jury, how do you get them to say, no, that's not what really happened? This was a calculated murder, because there are some people that will argue that, yeah, I could see that happening in that spot in Atlanta.
Right. I guess it's all going to boil down to the credibility of the witnesses. And of course, I'm sure some experts will be in the mix there talking about how likely it is for this type of thing to happen. It also depends on the type of firearm that you're talking about, because a lot of these firearms, they have either safeties or they have mechanisms on the trigger that don't allow the trigger to be pulled unless your fingers are in the right place and you're putting the appropriate amount of pressure to avoid accidental discharges of the firearm. Those are the things that I think are going to come into play. When you're in a bad neighborhood, of course, you're on high alert, as he claims he was. There were all types of statements flying around. At one point in time, one of his spokespersons said it was because he thought Black Lives Matter people were coming up to the car, so he wanted to be prepared. I think the devil is going to be in the details, and that's what's going to play out in court. Once we look at those things, we can say how likely or unlikely they are to support the story of Tex McIver.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think you hit the nail on the head, especially as it relates to the gun. I've been shooting guns for 20 plus years, and the first rule of shooting a gun is don't put this on the trigger until you're ready to pull it. You have a target, you intend to eliminate that target, basically. So it definitely comes into question that he was asleep, then he woke up, he was startled. There's just a whole bunch of this that really doesn't make sense at this point. And the fact that he owed his wife $350,000, of course, that's going to play a part in the jury. But let me ask this. There's another piece to this puzzle that may potentially play a part in this. Back in 1990, Tex McIver was indicted for shooting his gun at three teens that were, I think, on his yard. Do you think the jury will hear that, and what will it have on the outcome of this case?
Well, under normal circumstances, the jury would not hear that, as you know, Vincent, because it would be outside of the relevant material to this case. However, I know that the prosecution is trying to introduce what we call Williams Rule evidence to show that there may be a motive, or this is not actually a mistake. There's a modus operandi or a way of doing things that shows that this was not an accident, but it was an intentional act. That is the only way it will come in. I'm not sure whether the Williams Rule evidence they're seeking to introduce is about that, or if it's about the witnesses that he allegedly tampered with.
Got it. Now, his attorneys were on with us earlier, and they mentioned change of venue. Of course, we have this whole speculation of Black Lives Matter, and it was homeless, and it's a bad neighborhood. Do you think that his defense team will seek a change of venue?
They may seek a change of venue, but I don't think the chances for getting it granted are very high. The simple suggestion that he may have mentioned Black Lives Matter at some point in time, and that may have an effect on jurors, I don't think is enough to carry the day. Neither is whatever potential statements were made about the neighborhood. I think those are things that almost anyone from the area would admit, that sometimes this neighborhood can be sketchy, especially at certain times of night. And anyone would be concerned for their safety when they're there. I don't think that means you're not going to be able to find a fair and impartial jury in that area only because of those facts. They may ask for it. I don't think they'll get it.
Yeah, and we know juries love stories. And again, you said it at the very top of this. We have all the sexiness of this case. We're going to take a short break here and come right back. And then we're going to jump into the George Burch case out of Green Bay, Wisconsin. His trial and his conviction. We'll break that down here on Law and Crime. Hey, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I am Vincent Hill. We're going to take a minute here to look at the prosecution rebuttal in the George Burch trial, and then I'll bring back on Andell Brown, and we'll dissect this case. Take a look.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm very glad that Mr. Sugar chose to end his address to you by telling you that George Burch, his client, was able to come in front of you and fill in all of the gaps, all of the holes in the disjointed, scattered puzzle pieces of confusion that the defense is trying to present to you as some sort of reasonable explanation for why George Burch's DNA is all over Nicole, for why George Burch is the only person that we have evidence of that is at all of the major crime scenes. He filled in the gaps, he plugged in the holes, he prepared a scripted 3-hour direct examination to fill in every gap. And ask yourselves about his demeanor. Assess his credibility. Compare what he did on direct to what he did on cross. And is cross-examination difficult, and is it my role in part to make it difficult? Absolutely. But what else is difficult? Remembering things that didn't happen. Ask yourselves about how scripted and how prepared he looked on that direct examination. They took 2 hours to walk you through an inane recitation of going to McDonald's on the way home from Chicago, to try to build up for you this man of great character who went to church and came from a great community just like yours. A community where you don't tell the police anything or you'll get killed. A community he fled and left behind his wife and his children, this wonderful family man, this terrific dad who absconds probation in Virginia and flees to Wisconsin, away from his kids, away from the wife to whom he's still married. Such a wonderful father. That's fantastic. He filled in the holes with gibberish, with an utter absurdity of a tale. And all of the information about Doug Dietrich, all of it that they want to throw at you, is utterly irrelevant unless you believe his story. Because his story is the only thing that connects Doug to this crime. The only thing. They accuse the state of ignoring Doug Dietrich and saying that we didn't acknowledge that Doug Dietrich was an aspect that we needed to address. We spent 3 days worth of testimony on Doug Dietrich. We called Doug Dietrich. We called his friends. We called the officers who dealt with the initial part of the investigation. The state presented that evidence to you. We didn't hide from it. We didn't ignore it. You heard that he was arrested.
All right, Andell, so we had 9 days of a trial, countless witnesses, and a story that just seems so far-fetched from the beginning. Let me ask you this as a defense attorney. Do you believe his defense attorney even believed this outlandish story?
As a defense attorney, Vincent, it seems like his defense attorneys were trying to work with what they were given. We can make the arguments, but we don't create the facts. We have to take them as they are. And the facts were that there wasn't any evidence connecting Doug Dietrich to what happened other than George Burch's testimony. There wasn't anything that was going to exonerate George Burch other than telling a story that involved someone else. They had the DNA on the wiring that was found to have killed Nicole Vander Heiden. They had him at the scene of the crime. They had him at the scene of the burial. They had a truck that was burned trying to destroy evidence. I think it was very clear that without any testimony from George Burch or an alternative explanation that this was an open and shut case. So his defense attorneys did what they had to do. They worked with what they were given.
Yeah, and I really truly believe that George Burch came up with the name Douglas Dietrich after the arrest. I never believed the story for 1 second. I want you to stay with us here at Law and Crime Network. When we return, we will look further into the George Burch case and his conviction. Hey, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. Let's go right back to the courtroom of the George Burch trial and hear what the prosecution said during its closing arguments.
That he was investigated. You heard that the evidence excluded him. They want you to look at speculation and conjecture and all of the things that lead to the wrongful convictions that Mr. Sugar mentioned in his closing statement. Look at the story he told you. The story he told you is exactly what the state did in this case. Do we believe that Doug was involved at the beginning of the case? Yes, absolutely. Detective Slinger arrested him. And then he did exactly what Mr. Sugar implored that you do. We continued to investigate every aspect of this case. We didn't find surveillance video, but we found the next best thing. We found George Burch's DNA on Nicole's sock and no reasonable explanation for it to be there. There's no connection between these two people. And then we went on to find 16 different spots on her body where George Burch's DNA is present and Doug Dietrich's DNA is excluded. And absolutely listen to what Kevin Scott told you about DNA and how it's transferred. It's transferred generally with sustained contact, with consistent contact with a particular area. It's more likely to transfer under those circumstances. You saw Nicole's body. You saw those pictures. You know about the injuries. You know how brutal this attack was. She was strangled. She was beaten. There was persistent, consistent contact with her body. And none of Doug's DNA transferred to those areas? That doesn't make any sense. That's not reasonable. That's not logical. It's inconsistent with the truth. George Burch's DNA transferred to those areas because he's the one who had all that contact with her. And how does he explain it? By creating an utter fallacy, a fantasy that he doesn't tell to anyone until he takes this stand after hearing all of the evidence presented to you over the course of 8 days. He needs an explanation. Just like he needed an explanation for why he didn't call. I didn't call because I'm on probation. I was absconding. Or you don't tell people where I'm from. You don't call because you're guilty. And you know you're going to be found guilty. If he really didn't do this, whose DNA would he have suspected would have been on that body? The killer. You'd alert them right away. Let the authorities get out there and find the DNA of the person who did this. Find that murder weapon. Look at that scene. Find all your evidence. He would have come forward right away and allowed police to investigate this and exonerate them. He'd have shown up at their door with the bloody clothes and said, look, take these. The person who killed this woman had to have touched them, and here's where her body is. Go find your evidence. He didn't do any of that. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't tell his father figure, Ed Jackson. He didn't tell his girlfriend, Jordan Schuyler. He didn't tell the other two gentlemen that he lived with. He certainly didn't tell the police. Not even an anonymous call. Not even an anonymous tip. Go find this body. She might even be alive. Mr. Sugar talked to you about this tragic event that he went through. That it was a tragedy. It was a traumatic event. If you believe Mr. Burch's story, he was assaulted, hit in the head so hard that he was knocked out for God knows how long. Despite being knocked out, he has a specific, particular, step-by-step, blow-by-blow explanation of everything that he did. Why? Because it's crafted to explain the evidence in the case. Not because he remembers it. Think about how disorienting that would be. Struck in the head to the point where you are knocked out cold. But then he immediately woke up and he's very apparent. He knows his surroundings, right? I know where Doug is. I know exactly how many feet he is behind me. You see him in the rearview mirror with the dome light that came on that didn't work on cross-examination. Of course, the dome light works on direct, but it doesn't work on cross because it was inconsistent, right? Just like when the defense presents their case, the lighting is perfect. It's wonderful. Doug can see outside and immediately is going to make out that that's his girlfriend in the car with George. But then when we ask Mr. Burch about why he didn't see Doug, well, it's a dark area. It's a dark area over there. You can't see very well. Right? So George couldn't see Doug from 15 feet away. Doug's off to the right, 120 feet away inside his house, not even able to access the windows, but he's going to be able to see that George Burch is in the car having sex with Nikki. How's he even going to tell that's Nikki? And I love their presentation of Doug. Like, figure out, what's your argument? Is he the drunk, stupid guy at the bar? Or is he a cold, calculating killer? He isn't both. He can't be both. They're giving you pieces to a puzzle, like they said in their opening. The problem is they aren't the same puzzle. They're giving you pieces to 10 different irrelevant puzzles and asking you to throw them together and find a reasonable doubt. That's not what happened here. Doug was drunk that night. There's no question about it. You had testimony from everybody who was with him at the bar. Doug had been drinking. Doug had been doing a lot of shots. The guy that the defense dragged in to give you testimony, Max, he told you, yeah, I thought I was going to get left at the bar with drunk Doug because he's sitting at the bar having another.
Hey, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. Still joining me is Andell Brown, defense attorney out of Florida. And Andell, it sounds like, listening to the jurors after this conviction, that they were kind of back and forth with this whole thing. One juror said that there were times where he was very detailed in his story, and she said there were other times where he left a lot of detail out. There was another juror that said, she really didn't want to hand down a conviction, but it was based on the evidence, the DNA evidence. Do you think that the DNA evidence sealed the deal for George Burch in this case?
Without a doubt, Vincent. The DNA evidence was the evidence that convinced the jurors that it was George Burch and no one else that had to do with this heinous crime. And that's what they said. of course, there were certain holes, and some of the jurors said that they wished they could find out what really happened, acknowledging that there were questions that are unanswered. But in the end, it came down to the evidence, that DNA evidence being the strongest. It's what jurors trust, it's objective, and it made a powerful impact in this case.
That's right. And when we come back, Andell, I want to talk about DNA and how it has evolved since 1994 and 95. Remember the O.J. Simpson trial, when jurors really didn't understand what DNA was. And also I want to discuss what George Burch, his future holds. Will there be appeals in this case? I believe he probably will. But we'll discuss that next on the Law and Crime Network. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Vincent Hill, and still joining me is Andell Brown, defense attorney out of Florida. Andell, before the break, we talked about DNA and its advances. Just explain really quick to our viewers how DNA has advanced since the 90s.
Well, Vincent, thanks for that enviable task of trying to explain how DNA works. But in the 90s, as you mentioned, in the O.J. Simpson trial, and Barry Scheck was the lawyer that really was able to explain the DNA to the jury in that trial. Just coincidentally, he was one of my trial advocacy professors at Cardozo in New York. And since the 90s, it's progressed, so we can learn a lot more about the different types of DNA, about what they mean, how the different profiles can lead to different individuals. For instance, in the George Burch trial, we saw how the father and son share certain traits of DNA and certain types of DNA, where if the son was breastfeeding, you might be able to confuse that with the father. Of course, they had their experts come in and clean it up and explain that once you made those distinctions, then we could use it to show how George Burch's DNA was the only one found on the clothes found near the exit of the highway, on the wire that was used to kill Nicole Vander Heiden, as well as some of the other locations on her body under her fingernails, indicating the struggle that happened. That's the way they use DNA in this trial.
Yeah, and I think DNA is golden, right? We can talk technology, the Fitbit, the Google location, we can talk all of that, but no one has your DNA. It can't be tricked like technology can. As a defense attorney, I'm sure you would be telling your client, hey, let's appeal this. Do you think George Burch will try to appeal this case?
Absolutely, he will. I think it is almost par for the course, especially in a murder case, that there's going to be an appeal. I'm not sure on what grounds he will be appealing, but he's absolutely going to appeal. He's going to go to the higher court and see if they did anything wrong here.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, let's take it back to the courtroom and watch more of the prosecution's closing rebuttal.
Suggests that the two of them were together after the watering hole is that guy right there. The guy with the single most incentive to lie to you about what happened in this case. The only guy who had criminal convictions on the record, as you consider for his credibility. That's the only guy who says that they're ever together after the watering hole. And yeah, you saw Nikki's text messages. They were upset. She was upset at Doug. You also saw Doug's responses. LOL, Nikki, knock it off. Call me, please. Right? And that's after Nikki sends a slew of text messages. And Doug sends a few in response. And they're calm. Dallas Kennedy, who is pretty clear everyone saw Dallas. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to be testifying in court on this case. She said that Doug looked like he was trying to calm Nikki down. He was calm that night. He was drunk. If anything, he wasn't very attentive, that's for sure. When did he flip into this jealous, rageful, horrible individual? When did he turn into a calculated killer who took great lengths to cover up his crime? Cover up his crime? He left the flippin' murder weapon outside in front of his house for 2 days. Are you kidding me? There's no way that Doug was a calculated killer covering up his crime. All this stuff with the car, that's a red herring. That's way off in left field. You got the information from Progressive. That car didn't move. You had testimony from Don Chick, who's going to say, oh, I saw this car in the driveway with a blonde woman. Okay, maybe it was Friday, Don, when Nikki was out in her own car. Nikki's a blonde woman. It was noon. She went to get gas. She went out and did rummage sailing. Dallas told you that. Maybe his day was wrong. We know that car didn't move. And even if it moved, so what? It moved to do what? To cover up this crime? He would cover up the crime, but leave the murder scene and leave the murder weapon in front of his house for 2 days? Police didn't find it until May 23rd.
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. Up next, after the break, we'll go back inside the courtroom and actually hear the verdict being read. I assure you, no one has covered this trial more than here on the Law and Crime Network. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Vincent Hill. On yesterday, a jury of 6 men and 6 women convicted George Stephen Burch of the first-degree murder of Nicole Vandenheiden in Green Bay, Wisconsin. We're going to take a look at that verdict being read in the courtroom, and then we'll be right back.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we've been advised that you've reached a verdict. Is that correct? Then if you would pass the verdict forms over to the bailiff. State of Wisconsin versus George Stephen Burch, Brown County case 16 CF 1309. The verdict reads as follows. We, the jury, find the defendant, George Stephen Burch, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, is charged in the information. It is signed by our foreperson and dated this first day of March 2018. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is this your verdict?
Yes.
They are saying yes and shaking their heads. Does either party wish to have the jury polled?
Yes, Judge.
All right. There's a right to have the jury polled at this time, and this is how it will work. The juror right to the left of the bailiff. If that is your verdict, just you may say, yes, this is my verdict. If not, you can answer, no, this is not my verdict, and we'll just go down the row and around. So, is this your verdict?
Yes.
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 Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have one last instruction to read to you. Your service in this case is completed. And on behalf of the court, our court staff, and the citizens of Brown County, we greatly appreciate your service and the personal sacrifice that you've made in fulfilling your duties as responsible citizens. You have been a very attentive and patient jury. We thank you for your service. We hope that you will look back on this experience as a very positive one. You do not have to answer any questions about this case now from anyone other than the court. There is no requirement that you maintain secrecy concerning what happened in the jury room, but you do not have to discuss this case with anyone or answer any questions about it. If you care to do so, you may. It is your decision. Once again, thank you. Have a good evening.
And there you have it, a unanimous decision in the conviction of George Burch of the first-degree murder of Nicole Vandenheiden. As you can see, her family was very emotional when that verdict was read. Still with me, Andell Brown, defense attorney out of Florida. And Andell, we know Wisconsin does not have capital punishment. And of course, the conviction sentence for first-degree murder there is life in prison. I assume there's no way that George Burch can get out of this life sentence, is there?
I don't think so, other than getting the case overturned on appeal. He's looking at life here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I watched his reaction in the courtroom, and I think that was his only emotion that he showed when he was telling this story about how he met Nicole at the bar and they had sex, and then he woke up in the grass. There was really no emotion there, but I think it set into his head once he heard that verdict that his lie was up and there was no escaping this. And I truly believe that the jury had it right. They got it right in this case. What say you?
I think the jury got it right. I think they listened to the evidence. I don't think they jumped to conclusions in any form or fashion. I think they got it right. His story just didn't fly. It was controverted by too much evidence, the Fitbit data, the DNA, the Google Maps information that kind of showed where he was at what time. It all just made too much sense. And his explanation just didn't make sense. Jury got it right.
Yeah, absolutely. And, excluding the DNA evidence, there were so many things in this story that just made it so unbelievable. Here's a guy that's 6'7". You look at a guy like Douglas Dietrich, who is definitely not that size. He supposedly knocks him out, we assume with a pistol, since Douglas was supposedly armed, but yet there's no blood. There's no evidence that Douglas was ever in this car with George Burch. There were just so many things. And the fact, what got me the most was the next day, George Burch, he goes out on this fishing trip and he's posing for this picture. He's smiling, he's happy, but yet he knew what happened just the night before. And if his story was true, even if his story was true, I don't think a person that has compassion for a human being would go out on a fishing trip and just smile for pictures like nothing ever happened. It just never made sense to me.
I have to agree with you there, Vincent. And furthermore, I think George Burch's own testimony shot his defense in the foot, where he had witnesses come and testify that they saw George Burch a short time after. He had no injuries, no marks. The defense was trying to say that that was because he wasn't involved in the struggle, but I think that flies in the face of being knocked out with a gun to the point where you're unconscious. I mean, you don't have a scratch on you. You got knocked out by another guy. You were laid out unconscious, and there's nothing to show that you were involved in this. I just think the jury wasn't buying it, and rightfully so.
Yeah, and absolutely. I've taken so many police reports in my days in patrol where people actually have been pistol whipped, and they have been pistol whipped. There's no disputing the fact. You can't hit someone with a metal object and not leave a mark. It's just impossible. There was just so many things wrong with this case. And like I said earlier in the show, I believe truthfully that George Burch had months to come up with this story. He wasn't arrested until August of 2016. The murder happened in May of 2016. So he had several months to come up with this story. And when he saw Douglas Dietrich on the news, that's where he started to cultivate this story. This is my alibi if they ever find me.
I agree with you on that, Vincent. It seems like the story was contrived, made up, fairy tale, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, absolutely. I want you to stay right here with us on the Law and Crime Network. We have much more to come. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Vincent Hill. And if you're just joining us, we've been covering the George Burch case out of Wisconsin, convicted of first-degree murder in the murder of Nicole Vandenheiden. The jury convicted him on yesterday. That sentence carries a life sentence in prison. We want to switch gears a little bit and talk about a convicted child molester in Colorado, a Michael McFadden, who was sentenced to 300 years in prison. However, based on a technicality, he won't serve a day in jail. Take a look. I greatly apologize for that. I want to bring back on Mr. Brown, esteemed defense attorney out of Florida. So walk me through this. I mean, here's a guy that was convicted of 300 years for child molestation. I'm a father. My kids are much older, but I remember when they were younger. How does someone skate on 300 years in prison?
I mean, obviously the result sounds shocking, it sounds egregious, it sounds outrageous, but it's really just based on a technicality. It's not about the facts of the case. In that jurisdiction, the law says that within 6 months of someone entering a not guilty plea, they have to go to trial unless they waive their speedy trial rights. Here, they were halfway through a jury selection when the judge finally read a questionnaire that the defense had presented earlier. After reading the questionnaire, the judge said, wait a minute, there's no way this guy can get a fair trial. We are going to have to set this trial to another date and time. The defense objected. They said, no, we want to go to trial. He has a right to go to trial within this certain amount of time. And the judge gave a continuance over that objection. And just so that the audience knows, a continuance means we're going to set it off to another date. We're going to extend the process. That was the fatal flaw in due process that caused his conviction to be overturned. It wasn't about the facts. It was just a legal technicality.
So Andell, if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is because he didn't have a speedy trial, he was let go. Now, in all fairness, I mean, I've been to trials, I've arrested people and gone to court years later for that case. But I mean, this is not a jaywalking case. This is a child molestation case. So based on not getting a speedy trial, what that jurisdiction sees as a speedy trial, this guy walks?
Yeah, and the speedy trial is an important feature of due process because constitutionally you have to be brought up on charges that you can't be held indefinitely by the state. That's the way they look at it. Here in Florida, much like the other jurisdiction, speedy trial is a right. The way we get to the situations that you spoke of, Vincent, where you may have a case going to trial 1 or 2 years or even further down the line, that means at some point the defendant waived their right to a speedy trial. In this case, it wasn't waived. The court decided to postpone the hearing, postpone the trial without the defendant waiving their right to a speedy trial. That's how we get in this situation. It's not because trials don't take a while to come to fruition. It's because here the judge made a mistake. He tried to go forward and extend things without having the defendant waive their right to a speedy trial. It's about the constitutional rights that we all have and the court's obligation and the state's obligation to follow them.
Wow, and again, as a parent, I can't imagine. So how does the family now seek justice? Will they attempt to try this guy again, to charge this guy again for those same charges? Because clearly if he was indicted for it, there's evidence, there's probable cause to believe that the offense occurred. So where does the family go to get justice?
Well, the justice that they seek, they're not going to be able to find it through the criminal justice process, because once someone has been accused of a crime, once they've been tried for those charges, you can't be tried again. He's already gone through the process. We understand the constitutional concept of res judicata. You can only be brought up on a set of charges or a particular set of facts once. They can't try you for the same thing again and again and again. So unfortunately, there is no redress for this family in getting justice through the criminal justice system.
Yeah, Andell, I honestly don't know what to say on this one. You know, it's for the victim, it's very tragic, but I understand the law at the same time. Andell Brown, I want to thank you for joining me today. Greatly appreciate it. And coming up on the Law and Crime Network, we have a very special piece on the Holly Bobo case, which we covered exclusively here more than anyone on the Law and Crime Network. That's next.